Hi there, good afternoon. We're start on time, kind of correct. And we will finish on time at 6 o'clock as well. My name is Brendan Calder, and I'm a professor of management at the Rotman School. I have a course called Getting It Done. And that's where I met our guest speaker, Lidsky. That's where I met him. He showed up, what year was it?
2004?
Whatever it was a few years ago. The guy looks like he's still a teenager. And he showed up. And he's a fascinating guy, I got to know Mo really, really well. But let me tell you a little bit about him. And it's a pleasure to introduce him as a friend and as an alum and not a colleague yet. We're not make money yet. Mo is a partner and senior managing director of Prime Quadrant. Prime Quadrant is an investment research and consulting firm. Before that, while he was taking his classes, he was doing many things. Co-founder and owner of TMX, a group of automobile restoration companies in Northeast Ohio. Okay. A co-founder of Charity Bids, an online auction platform serving the nonprofit sector. And the one I like the best is I watched him do it, and it's still happening. Founding partner of Apex Global Capital, a regional microfinance company in the Caribbean. You mentioned doing microfinance as the lender in the Caribbean. Spent 5 years as the national director of and CEO of Yeshiva University, and I saw his little organization he was operating on top of authors and organizing it. Mo holds degrees in economics and psychology from Yeshiva University and his MBA from Rotman with distinction, at least from the Getting It Done. A lot can be good. Now, the reason we have so much fun is we spend time together. And it's going to be an enjoyable conversation. Mo, as you know, a lot of you got the book already, the co-author of The Philanthropic Mind, Surprising Discoveries from Canada's Top Philanthropists. He got inside. He got inside to talk to these people, the ones that get money. And he got in and asked them all kinds of questions, and they gave him answers, and he was able to write it up. It was published last year. The book will be on sale for those who don't have it at 6 o'clock as well. Well, congratulations on your book. I'm glad you're back. Go for it.
Thank you, Brendan, for that thoughtful and always entertaining introduction. Before we start, I actually must confess, after 8 years of post-secondary education, I must have had over 100 professors over those years. And Brendan stands out from all of them as being the only one that's not only truly a close friend, an ongoing mentor, but also somebody that continues to inspire my day-to-day life. Even this very morning, I have to tell you, I was speaking to a colleague of mine who showed up late. And I recalled Brendan's attendance policy in his class. Now, you got to understand something. If you are even 1 minute late to Brendan's classroom, your punishment is going up here in front of the class and singing solo. Solo. Not only that, Brendan, in his infinite wisdom, decided to even record some of these sessions and threatened to post them on YouTube if you stepped out of line again. And if anyone has ever heard me attempt to sing, they know that he has some highly compromising footage. So I think we're probably staying close to each other because I guess you know the expression, keep your friends close and, Now, in all seriousness, he's a treasure, one of the greatest assets this university has, and I really value our friendship, so thank you for that. And thank you to my alma mater, to the Rotman School Management for inviting me here, and to Steve and his entire team for organizing it. So thank you for having us. Okay, I have to use this thing. Okay, so I'm not going to get into any of this because this is the craziness of my life, and you already heard about it from Brendan. This is the gist of it, but I do want to touch briefly on my co-author, who's actually a lot more interesting than me. It's this guy right here, Chuck. And Chuck, he spent 25 years of his life helping nonprofits with their marketing communications, and I've been able to learn a lot from him. He's been an inspiration, and it was a pleasure to finish this project with him. So, you know something about us. Just I want to get an understanding of who's here. So just by a show of hands, who here is from the nonprofit sector? Okay, and by a show of hands, who here is from the for-profit sector? And who is unemployed with nothing better to do? Well, surprisingly more than I expected. Okay, on to the book. So the other day, a friend of mine, he asked me a question, as only a friend could ask. His question was actually very simple. He said, what were you mucking around for all these years for, talking to people? I mean, how bloody difficult is it to give away cash? And you know what? It's a great question. And the very short answer is that it's a lot harder than it seems. And what I learned by writing this book is that, which apparently Aristotle knew some 2,300 plus years ago, was that thoughtful and strategic philanthropy is actually a lot more difficult than it appears to be. And a lot of intelligent people around the world already recognize this. I mean, you don't have to be from the financial service industry to know that Warren Buffett is one pretty smart chap. And as smart as he is, he feels that he's ill-equipped to distribute his own fortune. And therefore, he gave the bulk of his $67 billion estate, committed it to the Gates Foundation. And he has said time and again that making money is a lot easier than giving it away. So this was actually a common theme that ran through the conversations that we had with the philanthropists that we interviewed. How to give, who to give to, in what measures, at what times, under what circumstances, and so on and so forth. And how to interact with the causes that meant the world to them. Now, I believe that the central struggle here was about what, in fact, is philanthropy. You know, we started every single interview, and by the way, Brendan was actually, who himself is an extremely philanthropic individual, was one of the people we interviewed. And we started every single interview by asking the question, what does philanthropy mean to you? And they offered many brilliant insights. Unfortunately, the funniest insights were the ones that came when the tape recorder was off. So they didn't make it into the book. I figured I'd share a couple of them. One philanthropist told me, philanthropy is based on the principle that it's better to give than to receive, as long as it's tax deductible. Another one told me, a philanthropist is an extremely generous man or woman whose relatives really hate them. And the third, who was probably the most prominent philanthropist and a prominent supporter of his community, said to me, philanthropy is the phenomenon where you're enjoying giving more than you're receiving. And he qualified and he says, it seems everyone in my community is content with leaving all the joy to me. You know, but all kidding aside, most of our interviews actually struggled to answer the question. They struggled because they were wrestling with the question of, is there a hierarchy or a spectrum of philanthropy? Are there some causes that are objectively more important than others? How is it different than charity? And on and on. I think I have to press this button. And I think one of the fundamental differences, and I think it's central to the struggle that they faced, was the difference between Greco-Roman philanthropy and Judeo-Christian philanthropy. And I'm just going to touch on this for a quick minute. But Greco-Roman philanthropy was focused on repairing buildings, majestic buildings, bathhouses, putting on ornate statues in the public domain. It was about sponsoring sporting events and art exhibits, academia, and even subsidizing haircuts or barbers for the masses. Greco-Roman philanthropy was not necessarily for the betterment of humanity, as much as it was for the betterment of the state and the betterment of its citizenry. Its distinguished citizenry, because the slaves and the impoverished and all those that weren't citizens were precluded from benefiting from it. And it was so clearly not for the benefit of humanity that actually the very first time that the word philanthropy is referenced, ever, is in the context of a critique at someone who was being charitable. So it was in reference to the Titan Prometheus in Greek mythology, whose crime was bringing fire down from Mount Olympus. He took fire and heat from the gods to bring down to humanity, to warm up the people. And for that act of philanthropist, as the word was used, he was chained to the mountains and had his liver eaten by eagles. Very graphic image. If we fast forward to around 300 CE, so the Roman Empire now adopted Christianity. And the view of charity and philanthropy began to evolve. And it evolved from being focused on the citizenry and the elite to being focused on the needy and the downtrodden. And philanthropy became more associated with the Good Samaritan than it was with the manicured bathhouses of Athens and Rome. And Christianity fostered this obligation, or at least spread this obligation, of feeding the hungry, housing the homeless, and clothing those that are needy, and so on and so forth, and healing the sick. And that is why, by the way, it was the bishops. It was the bishops that took over running the hospitals and social service agencies in the Roman Empire. And regardless of which orientation somebody comes with, every philanthropist we spoke to in some way or another oscillated between taking care of the state, the city, the community, the arts, and taking care of the needy, the suffering, and so on. And the reason we asked this question was because we wanted to understand what motivated their giving for the sole purpose of understanding what's the formula for the future. What's the formula for future giving? And that question proved to be exceedingly difficult to answer. By the way, we weren't actually the first to ask these questions. A couple of years before we embarked on this book project, there were two academics, name is Renee Beckers and Pamela Wipking. And this was a quest that, this philanthropic formula that has been bothering researchers for generations, and they were resolved to get to the bottom of it. So Renee and Pamela, they conducted countless experiments. They reviewed 500 peer-reviewed journals and studies on philanthropy that were across the widest range of disciplines: economics, psychology, anthropology, history, sociology, philosophy, even neurology, and so on and so forth. And yet, virtually every paper on the topic concludes with the researcher unable to develop a satisfying theory of donor behavior. And in the end, Renee and Pamela, although we didn't really schmooze, but they came to the same conclusion that me and Chuck did. And that is that the motivations for philanthropy are extremely complicated. And they cannot be summed up into a singular formula. So let me just give you an example. If we, just down the block from here, anybody recognize this building? Right? Down the block from here is the Jackman Humanities Building. And noted philanthropist Hal Jackman, who was the former lieutenant governor of Ontario, the former chairman of Empire Life Insurance, really exceptional financier, business leader, accomplished businessman, with a passion for supporting economics, finance, and business. And yet his greatest gift to U of T was $30 million to the Faculty of Liberal Arts, which he himself told us that he had no interest in. So why would someone make a gift to something that they weren't interested in? And when we asked him the question, he replied, and I quote, "They wanted me to do something because they had all kinds of people giving money to business and engineering, but liberal arts and humanities were being ignored." This is an example of somebody that wasn't supporting the specific cause, but supporting the institution. But if you were to then draw the conclusion that significant gifts come as a result of supporting the institution, you'd be way off base. Because just Even taking any other example, so this is, I don't know if any of you have been at Stratford Festival. This is what you're seeing. This was sponsored by Michael and Kelly Meehan, $5 million gift. And Kelly told us that they actually don't support Shakespearean theater, festivals, or anything of the sort. So why make the gift? When we prodded Kelly further, she said to us that it had nothing to do with Stratford, it had nothing to do with theater, it had nothing to do with Shakespeare, and it had everything to do with her mother and her grandmother and her grandfather, who grew up in Stratford. And she remembers when she was a little girl and her grandparents raving about what their little town had accomplished. And now she wanted her children to know the history. So this gift wasn't about the mission, it wasn't about the cause, it wasn't about the institution. It was about family, and it was about history. And in 2008, right after announcing his retirement from the NHL, Eric Lindros also announced that he was making a $5 million gift to the London Health Science Centre in appreciation of the doctors that had took care of him during his career. And with this announcement, he also announced the end of his check writing career. Now, Eric was a wonderful guy, and he continues to volunteer for many causes. But he assured me that he is never making a gift like this again. So fundraisers spend so much time on giving history, trying to crack the code of philanthropic motivations. But if you take the three gifts that we just looked at, they would not be in any way instructive about or predictive about these individuals giving in the future. And even if you looked at the mission statements of their foundations, you looked at their granting criteria, it wouldn't have helped you in any way. I mean, the T.R. Meehan Family Foundation, I wrote down what their mission is right here. It's to encourage strategic and creative initiatives benefiting youth at risk. Stratford? And yet here we are. The bottom line is there is no singular formula to explain philanthropic behavior. And even if philanthropists have their own rules, they'll break them whenever it suits them. And that's just fine. So if philanthropic motivation is so complex, how do we boil it down into something that is useful, that is accurate, and hopefully simple? I struggled a lot. I mean, what actually explains philanthropic behavior? And it occurred to me that the answer can be found in triangulating the variables that drive the philanthropic engagement and philanthropic impact. And these are, easily displayed through this Venn diagram, but let's dissect these a little bit. So in simple terms, the role of any organization is to identify issues, propose solutions, engage partners, and empower those partners to make a difference. And by doing that, it allows the individuals with whom the cause resonates to engage and invest in its future. It's as simple as that. Now, when thinking about engaging partners, it's important to remember that the philanthropists we interviewed are in the minority. If you look at the data on the ultra-rich, and I mean 50 million plus, only 17% of them contribute in any meaningful way. And if you look at the data on the affluent, on the mass affluent, it's not any more flattering. In fact, the mass affluent give a much smaller percentage of their net worth than lower and middle class individuals. It's 25% difference. And while these numbers are disappointing, the encouraging thing is that those that give a lot. And they give again and again and again. And throughout many of our conversations, it almost sounded like philanthropy was that itch that they just could not stop scratching. And from Eric Sprott telling me that he gives more than he's being solicited for at least 25% of the time. to Eddie Sunshine telling me that he doesn't have the heart to ever have somebody walk out of his office without a check, to Linda Frum telling me that when she and Howard come back from a fundraising evening they sponsored, many a time they'll say, you know, we didn't give enough. And in fact, when we asked everybody the question, what were your biggest regrets? Most said they had no regrets. But the ones that did said they regretted not giving earlier and not giving more. The key is to find those with that philanthropic itch. And that is also, by the way, keep in mind for anybody who's out there soliciting, that those that are inflicted with this philanthropic itch, they also have to protect themselves from themselves. And the reason that they won't take your meeting is not because they don't want to support your cause, but because they do. And they just can't do it all. As one philanthropist actually told us, they said, I am going to fall in love with the next cause that walks through the door. And that's why I can't let them in. There's a lot of truth to that. But it's, you know, while it's easy to focus and it's tempting to focus on those that have a visible itch, the ones that appear in the media and the papers that have made those major gifts, it's also critically important to find those closet itchers. It's definitely not a word, but we'll go with it. The ones that don't yet have the capacity or perhaps not yet the opportunity to give. The greatest, one of my favorite stories, which again, unfortunately did not make it into the book, was about Charles Juravinski. So those of you from Hamilton might know Charles from the Juravinski Hospital, the Juravinski Cancer Center. But before Charles had his name on any buildings, before he gave any major gifts, he was just a humble businessman. And he had a couple of operating companies, and one of them he owned the Flamborough Downs racetrack. And, you know, when he was in business, he didn't have any big dollars to write any major checks. But what everybody knew was that Charles had an itch to help anybody that came his way. Anybody with a need, Charles was there. And in 2003, Charles sold Flamborough Downs to Frank Stronach. And right after the deal closed, he had a party at his house. And he invited to that party 16 executive directors from healthcare organizations in and surrounding Hamilton. He was a nobody at this time, keep in mind. He didn't write any big checks. 16 executive directors. 5 of them showed up. What none of them knew, especially those that didn't come, was that Charles was going to give away $16 million that night, unsolicited. And since only 5 of them showed up, he split the money accordingly and gave each of them a multi-million-dollar gift and thanked him for keeping the community in which he thrived a healthy one. Now, just imagine what the executive directors who didn't show are feeling like the next day. Yeah, I don't want to be in their seat. But the point is that generous and capable individuals are usually visible well before they come into great wealth. And nonprofits have to treasure and engage these individuals as partners as early as possible. Now, of course, the trouble with partners is that they don't always see things like you do, which is going to be the next topic. Seymour Schulich is a remarkable human being. He's a close friend, a wonderful guy, and he would allow himself to be called a highly demanding donor. And in my conversations, he kept on reiterating his distrust of university bureaucracies. And I hope I don't get kicked off the stage for saying this, but I'm just quoting what he told me. He says, "Keep money out of the hands of the goddamn universities." That was his line. Which didn't make any sense because here he is, the single largest donor of universities in the country. but he views it as keeping money away because he does it on his own terms. See, Seymour Schulich has 4 key criteria for every gift that he gives. His 4 key conditions. 1, half the money has to be spent on scholarships. 2, the other half goes into what he called like a dean's super fund. He's trying to create academic entrepreneurs, which the deans could spend as they wish without anyone's approval. 3, its third condition is it has to be matched by others, by either the government or private supporters. And 4, his final condition is the performance awards for the faculty are to be judged by the students, not by the deans or their academic peers. Now, why would an institution agree to these crazy terms? Well, for starters, Schulich's gifts are usually in the $15 to $25 million range. That helps. But I think, even more importantly, is that it works. In virtually every case where Schulich got involved and insisted and imposed these criteria, student enrollment went up, faculty size went up, physical space went up, and donations went up in the years after his gift. And just to give you one example that's close to home, after he gave his $26 million gift at Western, one of his criteria was that for that same faculty, the dentistry and medical faculty had to raise another $17 million over the next 15 years. They did it in 3. And in a few more years, they raised over $100 million. So organizations, that could be why organizations in university are clamoring for his support. Because they recognize that his demands also, besides his capital, has the potential to transform their organization. Okay, so besides organizational considerations, philanthropic behavior also needs to be, it often needs intrinsic and extrinsic motivations. And you see here, I mentioned some of them, but let's to start with the intrinsic. Let's start with begin with passion. So history suggests that passion is highly effective. It is the essentially, the transfer of emotion that converts somebody that's neutral into a believer. And Don Johnson, our mutual friend Don, who's the former vice chair of BMO, he told us about a particular meeting that he did not want to take. And he had no capacity to sponsor anything else at this point in time in his life. And somehow, Frances Lankin, the CEO of United Way, sneaked in there. She squeezed in, and she was so energized and so passionate about these community hubs that they were building to help people in Toronto's to help those in Toronto's most disadvantaged neighborhoods, that Don committed $1 million on the spot. And he said that, first of all, he surprised himself when he went home that night. But second of all, he said to me, and he said it on multiple occasions, it was entirely due to her passion. I was infected, and I couldn't control myself. And psychologists Netta Weinstein and Richard Ryan, they demonstrated, actually, it's very interesting, that when giving is done out of passion, it has psychological benefits, an energizing force, where donors feel fulfilled and empowered. Whereas when people give out of duty or obligation, there is no incremental psychological effect, no energizing, and no improvement to their mental well-being. So passion is key. And the way that passion is often engendered is through engagement. So just to give you another Don Johnson example, because he gave us a lot of good ones. And this is what Jerry Schwartz, the CEO and chairman of Onyx Corporation, described. This is the cycle that he's referring to. So in the late 80s, so Don was asked to join the board of what I think was called the Eye Research Institute. He wasn't terribly interested, but eventually he conceded and he joined the board. He certainly wasn't prepared to invest anything. Fast forward a whole bunch of years later, and all of a sudden the Eye Research Institute has the opportunity to hire one of the stars of the eye disease world. And Don says, we got to make this happen. And the university and the hospital says, we want to make this happen, but we don't have the money. Don says, you got to come up with the money. He's looking, figuring out, nothing doing. Eventually says, Don says, I don't care what we have to do, we're going to come up with the money. Well, when you looked left and you looked right and there was nobody there, Don put up the $5 million to provide the research support that this particular fellow needed in order to leave his post and come to Western, to the Research Eye Institute, and committed $5 million, and that is why today it is called the Donald K. Johnson Eye Center at Western. As Jerry Schwartz had said, so involvement leads to liking it, appreciation, that leads to understanding, that leads to wanting it to succeed, and eventually that leads to financing it to succeed. Now, there is I have this all the time, because my oldest just started blogging. The three others are enviously looking on. But it's important to note that engagement means very different things to different people. And for example, one of the most consistent, call it divides, call it features, that we saw across all of our conversations was this generational divide. There was a fundamental difference between how first-generation philanthropists approached their giving and second- or third-generation philanthropists approached their giving. And it had many different ramifications. So the first-generation givers, they tend to view themselves as donors, and they're supporting someone. They are engaged based on the trust and vision of the organizational leadership. And they are often happy to just write a check and be left alone. They place a lot more value on the institution. The second and third generation, they view themselves as investors. And they're not invested supporting someone, they're partnering with someone. And they are engaged due to the impact of the organization. And they want metrics and they want accountability. And they place much greater value on the cause. And the reason it's important to understand what meaningful engagement is, because the absence thereof leaves people exhausted, uninterested, and uninspired. So in the industry, I guess this is referred to as donor fatigue, right, or donor burnout. And it was presumed that donors fatigue because they give too much of their time, money, resources, etc. The theory goes, you write too many checks, you sit on too many boards, you go to too many events, eventually you're just too much goodness, and you need a break from it all. Well, psychologists Olga Kalimke and Tanya Singer say that's actually not at all the case. According to their research, people don't burn out because they're giving too much. They experience donor fatigue because they sense that their giving doesn't have because they sense that their giving is not doing enough. Because it's not having the impact that they would like it to have. So the right form of engagement becomes critical. Now, turning to extrinsic motivation. And you know how you could increase the probability of getting a much larger gift? I like to call it cross-pollination. So one of Izzy Sharp's largest gifts was $15 million donation to the Four Seasons Opera House. Now, he will be the first to admit that the motivation for this gift was not altruism. Rather, it was largely due to the fact that Izzy realized that the cost of this gift is roughly 5 times what he was spending on marketing in the GTA annually. So, and all that in exchange for a fantastic brand asset perfectly aligned in the heart of Toronto. So yes, it was a good cause. But once you amortize it over a few years, it becomes a really great investment. And this speaks to the fact that it's prudent to appeal to both the philanthropist and the business person. Because the capital pool is much greater when it includes a portion of the commercial budget, so to speak. And it can create a lot of win-win scenarios for everyone involved. And this is something, I mean, on a personal level, just from having all these conversations, I think it's one area that the nonprofit community, even the for-profit community, has not yet figured out and has not given enough attention to. And by the way, it actually pays. This is not just like anecdotal or a nice-sounding idea. Economist Arthur Brooks, he used reams of data, aggregated all these reams of data on 30,000 Americans. And he proved that charity actually increases one's prospect of future earnings, of future income. So his studies have demonstrated, you could agree or disagree with them, but they have demonstrated that for every incremental dollar of charity given, individuals' future incomes increase by $3.75. It's actually staggering. I don't fully believe it, but even if it's half true, it's pretty impressive. And by the way, if it was only one study, I wouldn't say anything. But there were studies that came out of New York University and studies that came out of the University of Texas on corporate giving. And those studies concluded that corporations that were extraordinary in their charitable corporate giving programs also were highly correlated with increased future revenues. In fact, there were a whole bunch of mutual funds that were created with the sole mandate of investing in companies known for extraordinary charitable giving because of the promise of, I guess, increased or superior future returns. If we truly believe that, if we believe that data, would our collective percentage of our income, let me rephrase that, would we still be giving 3% of our budget to charity? Would corporations still have their charitable budget be a nominal line item on the balance sheet? The fact remains that I think the industry, and it was clear from all of our conversations, the industry can do a better job of helping corporations do well by doing good and maximizing their charitable contributions and increasing their own success in the process. So now I'm going to get to the slightly more controversial waters of extrinsic motivation. I want to comment on perks. Take a drink before you shoot me. So one of the things that people forget is that while everybody we interviewed, they're all exemplary, extraordinary individuals, they are all human. Every philanthropist is human. And as such, no matter what they'll tell you, they want to feel special, they want to feel appreciated, and they appreciate the right kind of perk every now and then. And whether that's, getting a front table at some dinner, whether it means front row seats on opening night at the opera, whether it means for Tiff getting into the green room with Angelina Jolie. For some reason, you didn't get me in last time. Next time. They're all appreciated. Where this gets controversial and even made our interviewees queasy was when it comes to healthcare. Should individuals who paid for building the hospital be given preferential treatment? Should they be able to get medical treatment of others who did not pay for the building, who did not pay for the operating room, and who did not pay for the research that came up with the procedure that's now saving thousands of lives? And this is where we had an enormous amount of variability. And we had some that vehemently insisted they didn't expect, they didn't want. I'd rather die on the street. Nobody wants. No, but in all seriousness, they claimed that they really expected nothing. But the majority either sheepishly or unabashedly, felt that somehow the relationship should mean something, and that the support should translate into the organization going the extra mile. I spoke at a conference at a different conference about a related topic, and a woman got up and unleashed an attack on me like I can't describe. She said that I was promoting the worst form of prejudice where the rich were able to buy life, leaving the poor for dead. I mean, I honestly was trying to peel myself off the ground when she was done talking. And I think that, she may have been a little dramatic about this. And I take no position on the issue, for the record. But what was clear is that there are very strong and legitimate perspectives on both sides of this. And it's also clear that philanthropists have a lot of unspoken expectations, which organizations and fundraising professionals and the philanthropists themselves have to deal with. And the bottom line is that philanthropy, like any other enterprise, it is worth spending time to figure out how you could add more value to your supporters, but doing it within the without compromising the mission or the integrity of the organization. Now, in the end, you guys recognize that pretty face? In the end, what was clear from all of our conversations was that it's all about people, people, and people. And as Brendan said right here, we give our time to causes, but we give our money to people. And I've been asked, people have said, after all your research, what would you say is the one surefire way to get the gift? And the truth is, there is no answer to that question. But the closest solution is to find that person, the prospective donor cannot say no to. And as David Cinnamon here says, everybody has somebody in their life they can't say no to. And sometimes it's easier to convince them than the donor. And the bottom line of philanthropy is that it's a contact sport. And anybody that's not prepared for constant contact is probably in the wrong industry. So this is the last segment, which is communal. So the final predictor, this is of philanthropic behavior, is all these communal considerations. And that involves the combination of needs, the impact, the opportunity. And by the way, all of this needs to also be considered within the broader interests of society as a whole. So it's interesting because sometimes the needs come from the beneficiaries. And sometimes the needs come from the philanthropists themselves. And incidentally, this often happens when donors are complaining. And as long as the organization's leadership doesn't get defensive, there may be a tremendous opportunity here. So I'll give you one example. So Ed Sunshine, who's the chairman and CEO of RioCan, he was at Mount Sinai Hospital awaiting his first grandson. And him and his wife Fran are standing there in the waiting room of the maternity ward, and they are not impressed at all. And sometime after the baby's born, Ed meets Joe Mappa, the CEO of the hospital, at a kind of cocktail event, some kind of fundraiser, and he starts kvetching. He lays it in. He says, Joe, the waiting room in the maternity ward is a disgrace. It is dirty. The couches are so filthy. I stood for 3 hours. The phone isn't working, and even the television is broken. Joe, you got to do something about this. Unfazed, without a moment of hesitation, Joe Mappa says to Eddie, the government doesn't give us money for that kind of stuff. So why don't you buy us a waiting room? Eddie was, what just happened? Joe doesn't stop. He says, Eddie, we'd love a new waiting room. It would be fantastic. It would add to the hospital. And if you think it's so important, and you think it's important enough that you'd complain about it to me, then why don't you go and buy us one? And Ed was stuck in a corner, had no way out, and he says, all right, I'll call the office, we'll figure something out. Anyway, besides purchasing that waiting room, A couple of years later, when Mount Sinai was building a new wing, they were building a new maternity waiting room. Joe calls up Ed and he said, Ed, I got something that's twice as nice, twice as big, twice the price. And now there's this waiting room right here, which is another 2 waiting rooms from this. The point being that the greatest complainers often become the greatest collaborators. And visible communal needs could be a great motivator for action. And once the need is assessed, the next key consideration is impact. How could this have the greatest impact on society? So, great example of this is Carlo Fideni. He was approached by a local hospital to buy a gamma knife. I don't think it's a knife, actually, but from what I understand, I believe it's like the most precise radiation tool out there for brain tumors. That's my rudimentary understanding of it. And so Carlo agreed to do it on 3 conditions. 1, that it actually is the best technology out there, when he convened a panel of experts and verified that that's the case. 2, that there's matching funding. He said, I'll pay half, you got to get a matching donor. He could have all the credit, he or she could have all the credit, have their name on it, and he got Joey and Toby Tenenbaum, put their name on it, and Carlo basically asked for no credit, not for his involvement, nor for his gift. And 3, here's the kicker, he insisted that it be used and shared by other hospitals to maximize the impact of his gift and break down the silos that existed and may to some extent still exist in some healthcare institutions. And while the hospital initially resisted, they eventually agreed, and this collaboration paved the way for a lot more shared resources and saved the healthcare system millions of dollars and created access to this life-saving tool for thousands of Torontonians. One of the key messages from the Ed Sunshine story is that philanthropy, like any other business, is opportunistic. Got to get the opportunity. But it's important to remember that these organizations are still in the business of serving humanity and not necessarily capturing every last dollar or pressuring donors into submission. I had Jerry Sheff, former CEO and chairman of Gluskin Sheff. He had a very comical story that he shared with me. He was once in the hospital with a burst appendix. And he's sitting there waiting surgery, and the doctor walks in where Jerry is stationed. And the doctor didn't know Jerry from a hole in the wall, but he recognized his name from his various philanthropic projects. So as Jerry is sitting there with a burst appendix waiting for surgery, the doctor says, Mr. Sheff, can I talk to you about some of our research programs? Jerry has a fit. He's like, you want to talk about this now? And the doctor, I guess, quickly realized the awkwardness of the moment. And he says, no, I guess after the operation is fine. And Jerry said, he felt like he was being blackmailed. You talk about this now, it's surgery A. We talk about this later, it's surgery B. But the idea is that fundraisers and great business people recognize the moment of opportunity. But they also know how to tread carefully and gauge the appropriateness of that moment, because the relationship is more valuable, it's often more valuable than the opportunity itself. Now, I actually, I was speaking at another event about a month or two ago, and on a completely different topic. And one of the attendees asked me about philanthropy, and they asked me, what if you only have one shot? One chance. There is no relationship to be had. And it reminded me of a story that we included in the book. It's a cute story. 1930s. So at this point, Henry Ford was in his later years. He was already one of the wealthiest people on the planet. And he decides he wants to pay a visit to Ireland, to the humble village from whence he came. And this became huge news in the village. Henry Ford was coming back. And the night that Henry Ford arrived, All the villagers gathered right there at the gate to greet him. And Henry Ford, the minute, he just stepped over the threshold of the village. And some guy, some schnook, screams out, "Mr. Ford, I don't know if you know, but we're building a community hospital in the village. Can we count on you for a contribution?" He's a little surprised by the immediate solicitation, but he says, "Okay, I'd be pleased to contribute $5,000. Just mind you, this is the 1930s. A lot of money. And with that, he bid the villagers good night. The next morning, Henry Ford is sitting there eating breakfast, and the solicitor, the schnook, runs in, and he's huffing and puffing, and he says, "Mr. Ford, I'm terribly sorry. There's been an egregious mistake. And the mistake was in this morning's newspaper." And he handed Henry Ford the newspaper, and he says, and right here, "I'm so sorry, I don't know how this happened, this was a typo." It said right there in bold, large letters, "Henry Ford launches village hospital campaign with an unprecedented gift of $50,000. And all the villagers look on at the shocked Henry Ford as he sees this headline. And quickly, the schnook, the solicitor, he's quick to say, "Oh, Mr. Ford, please, don't worry. In tomorrow's newspaper, we plan to print a retraction, equally bold, large print on the front page right here. Rest assured, we're going to set this straight." Ford, he regained his composure, and he said, "It's not necessary." He said, "I'll honor my $50,000 pledge." He says, "But I need you to make a pledge of your own. I am going to put the plaque on this hospital, and you are not going to see it until the day of the opening ceremony." And they say, sure, fine. Anyways, 5 years later, the day arrives, the opening ceremony, all the villagers are gathered, and the box arrives from Henry Ford. They open the box as they're gathered to raise up this plaque. They raise it up, they open it up, and on it they see nothing except one little verse from Matthew 23:25, which says, "I came to you as a stranger, and you took me in." And the takeaway from this story is that when you have limited or singular opportunities, you can push the envelope for sure, and you may even be successful. But it behooves fundraisers to remember that they not only represent their organizations, they also represent the interests of society. And if by employing compromising practices, we are making philanthropists more reluctant to give in the future, that compromises the interests of society as a whole. And so what we come back to is this philanthropic mind can be summarized in this philanthropic Venn. And it looks so simple. But as Warren Buffett said, it's simple but not easy. And it's not easy because, as we saw, thoughtful strategic philanthropy is hard. There is no specific formula. There's no singular form of engagement. Philanthropy requires opportunism, but without compromising our relationship. It requires intrinsic and extrinsic motivations, but without tarnishing philanthropy for society as a whole. And in the end, it all comes down to partnering with people, finding their passion, identifying the individual with that philanthropic itch, and engaging them in a way that they need to be engaged. And when the confluence of these three things come together, the personal, the organizational, the communal, it can be both predictive about future philanthropic behavior, as we have seen through all of our conversations. And more importantly, it offers all the philanthropic participants, the donors, the board members, the volunteers, the fundraisers, the highest probability of success. And it's not easy, but each of us has the potential to elevate that philanthropic endeavor, at the very least by celebrating its participants. And to drive this point home, I've just couple more minutes, I'm going to close with the following story. In 2001, when Michael Bloomberg assumed his new role as the mayor of New York City, he also assumed a $6 billion budget deficit. $6 billion deficit. And he spent the next several years aggressively cutting budgets. He hired property taxes, and he slashed funding across almost all city agencies and a lot of the art organizations. And yet, at the same time as he was making these difficult decisions as a politician, and he was doing this as a politician, he was increasing his donations as a private citizen, personally donating over $140 million to the causes that, to subsidize the struggling causes that were no longer on the city's payroll. And on the one hand, he was making difficult decisions in the interest of the city. And on the other hand, he was softening the blow for these valuable organizations out of his own pocket. And besides dispensing his hard-earned money, he also wasn't taking anything from the city, foregoing his salary the entire time he was in office. Not utilizing the Macy Mansion, which every other New York mayor has used ever in history. And he took the subway to work. And yet, despite these countless displays of selflessness and self-sacrifice for the city, the media proceeded to lambast him for buying influence, for paying off his dissenters. They eviscerated the guy's reputation, just as he had completely paid off the city's deficit, just balanced the budget, completely balanced the budget. He took nothing for it, and he subsidized all those that had to live with his difficult decisions. To me, this was an absolutely remarkable display of leadership. And yet, the message this episode sent to other philanthropists is, no good deed goes unpunished. And I share this story because in today's scandal-obsessed world, it's very easy to attack, it's very easy to be cynical, it's very easy to criticize. And as a result, it's easy to discourage philanthropy, to discourage generosity, and discourage engagement. But like all humans, philanthropists aren't perfect. They all have their foibles and their quirks like the rest of us. And yes, the divide between the haves and the have-nots is growing at a scary pace. But we need the enterprise of philanthropy to grow. And we need it to flourish in every corner of the world. And that growth won't happen through attacks on its imperfect participants. And philanthropy will thrive when it is celebrated, when it is encouraged, and when it is better understood. And we wrote this book for that exact reason. And I hope that this is only the start of a much more meaningful conversation. And kudos to each of you for coming here. I thank you very much for inviting me, and I thank you for listening.
I've read the book. The book is almost as entertaining. Almost as entertaining. It's actually quite good. There's more for sale out there. You're going to hang around for questions.
Sure.
No, just it's going to hang around.
Yeah.
The meeting's over, but you'll hang around for any kind of questions or anything like that.